Chapter 8. The Colosseum. The gladiators waited for their contest in an area that was at the same level as the sand of the arena. In there they were given helmets, body armor, and swords. Proximo's guards led his gladiators into the area, and Maximus walked over to a window. He looked out at the sand that seemed to continue forever. Maximus spoke in a low voice to one of the guards. "Is the Emperor here?" he asked. "He'll be here," the guard replied. "He comes every day." One of the guards held out a helmet to Maximus. He shook his head and looked instead at the other helmets. He chose one with a better face guard and tried it on. He turned his head back toward the arena, knowing that now his face could not be recognized. Proximo's gladiators were armored and ready. They were dressed to look like soldiers from Carthage. They carried spears and long, curved, heavy shields. As they waited to go out into the arena, an official spoke to them. "You have the honor of fighting in front of the Emperor himself," he said. "When the Emperor enters, raise your spears in salute. When you salute him, speak together," he said. "Face the Emperor. Don't turn your backs." "Go," Proximo said. "Die with honor." His 5 best gladiators walked past him and onto the sand of the arena. Maximus was the last to step onto the floor of the great Colosseum. He had never imagined such a sight. There were thousands and thousands of screaming, shouting people. All around him was an ocean of cheering faces. It took his breath away. The gladiators moved into the center of the sand. At the same time, 3 other teams appeared in the arena from different entrances. There was now a total of 20 gladiators on the Colosseum stage. All wore the same armor and carried long double-pointed spears and heavy metal shields. They stood in a line and faced the Emperor's seat. It was still empty. 50 royal guards surrounded the area where Commodus and his friends would sit. Then Commodus and Lucilla entered, and the crowd went wild, cheering and shouting salutes. Lucilla and Lucius went to their seats. Commodus moved forward and waved to the crowd. Gaius and other senators near the Emperor watched in silence. They had just heard the latest news. To help pay for the games, Commodus was taking the houses and money of senators he disliked. Commodus looked down at the gladiators, and Maximus froze as he felt his eyes rest on him. He stared up at the man he hated and wanted to kill. On one side of Commodus, he saw Quintus. On the other side, Lucilla and Lucius. The distance between them was too great. This was not his chance. He knew there would be a better one. When Cassius gave a sign, the gladiators all saluted with their spears and shouted, "Caesar, we salute you before we die." Only Maximus was silent. Cassius stepped forward to introduce the afternoon's events. "On this day, we reach back into history to bring you the Battle of Carthage." The crowd cheered loudly. They laughed at the gladiators dressed as the soldiers of Carthage, the battle's losers. Then Cassius continued. "On that great day, the gods sent them against Rome's greatest soldiers, the army of Africa." The crowd cheered again as the doors at the ends of the arena suddenly opened with a crash, and 6 chariots came in from each end. The chariots raced through the line of gladiators who jumped out of the way. They turned and came back, running over one gladiator. Then the chariots raced around the outside of the arena, forcing the gladiators back into the center. It was difficult for the men on foot to see well through the cloud of dust and sand from the wheels of the chariots. As they thundered past, Maximus saw a spear flying through the air. It hit one of the gladiators in the neck and killed him immediately. Maximus could see that he must take control, and he called to the other gladiators. "If we work together, we can win!" He made them move in closer. "Shields together! Shoulders against the shields!" he called. The gladiators followed his orders, except for one. Hakon stood alone, ready to fight his own battle. The crowd was very surprised. They had never seen anything like this before. The men in the chariots circled around the group, firing arrows and spears, but they only hit the gladiators' shields. A Roman spear from one chariot hit Hakon in the leg. Juba threw his spear and killed the driver, and Maximus pulled Hakon into the safety of the group. 2 chariots drove straight at the gladiators. Fixed to their wheels were short, sharp spears. As the wheels turned, they could cut a man to pieces. But the shields were good protection, and the wheel spears broke when they hit them. The wheel of one chariot hit the corner of a shield, and the chariot turned over. Another driver, close behind, crashed into it and was thrown out. His chariot raced on, and its wheel spears killed him as he tried to get away. A third chariot was very close, and both vehicles crashed into the gate. Maximus ran for one of the broken chariots and cut the horse free. He jumped onto the horse and rode fast toward one chariot. The driver was watching Maximus carefully. He did not see that he was very close to another vehicle. Their wheels touched. Both drivers were thrown onto the sand. One was killed by Maximus's spear, and the other died under the feet of his horse. The gladiators pulled 2 crashed chariots into the path of the others, who were forced to slow down. Then they rushed at the drivers, striking them with their spears. Maximus looked around. All their enemies were dead. He climbed down from his horse, and the gladiators stood on either side of him. Hakon was among them. In the arena, Maximus, for the first time, raised his right arm and sword high. It was the gladiators' traditional sign of beating death. The crowd cheered wildly. Commodus called for Cassius. "My history is not so good," he said, "but I thought we won the Battle of Carthage." "Yes, sir," said Cassius, his voice shaking with fear. "Forgive me." "Oh, I'm not unhappy," said Commodus. "I enjoy surprises." He pointed to Maximus. "Who is he?" "They call him the Spaniard, sir." "I think I'll meet him," said Commodus. The gladiators were almost at the gate. Maximus turned and saw the emperor walking out onto the sand, smiling at him. He noticed a broken arrow in the sand, and, as he fell to his knees, he quickly closed his hand around it. This would be his chance. Commodus was nearly there, just a little further, almost close enough to kill. Maximus was ready. Suddenly, Lucius ran out and took Commodus by the hand. Commodus laughed and moved the boy in front of him, facing the gladiator hero. Maximus could not strike. Lucius was in the way. "Stand, stand," said Commodus to Maximus. "Now, why doesn't the hero tell us his real name?" Maximus stood and said nothing. "You do have a name?" asked Commodus. "My name is Gladiator," Maximus said. Then he turned and walked away. It was a great insult to turn his back on the emperor. The crowd were shocked. Commodus was very angry. He made a sign to Quintus, who moved the royal guards into the arena. They stood at the gate, swords ready, and did not let Maximus pass. Commodus spoke calmly and clearly. "Slave," he said, "you will remove your helmet and tell me your name." Slowly, Maximus turned to face him. He knew he had no choice now. He took off his helmet. Commodus stared. Quintus could not believe his eyes. Lucilla recognized Maximus from her seat in the arena and put her hand over her mouth in total shock. Maximus spoke in a clear, proud voice. "My name is Maximus Decimus Meritus, commander of the Army of the North, general of the Western armies, loyal servant to the true emperor Marcus Aurelius." The Colosseum was completely silent. Then he turned to Commodus and spoke more quietly. "I am father to a murdered son, husband to a murdered wife, and I will punish their killer. in this life or the next. Commodus gave a sign to his guards, and they moved closer. The crowd shouted out. They had seen enough deaths for one afternoon, and they did not want their hero to be the next one. They reached out a forest of thumbs, pointing up to the heavens. Their meaning was clear. Let him live. Commodus looked around at his people, and with great difficulty he forced himself to smile. He slowly lifted his own thumb. The crowd cheered. "Maximus! Maximus!" they shouted. Lucilla and the senators could not believe the scene happening in front of them. Another shocked face was watching from his seat in the Colosseum. It was Cicero, Maximus's servant in the army. As he watched the general, his mind saw many possibilities. Maximus led his men from the arena. He looked back just once from the gate and thought, the battle hasn't ended yet. In the darkness of the palace, Lucilla stopped in front of the doors to Commodus's room. She took a deep breath before she entered. Commodus sat calmly at his desk signing papers. Lucilla was surprised that he was not still in a violent temper. When he returned from the Colosseum, he had screamed in anger and attacked a picture of Marcus Aurelius. Now he was quieter and behaving quite normally. She walked up to the desk. "Why is he still alive?" he asked her. "I don't know," she said. "He shouldn't be alive," her brother said. "That makes me angry. I am terribly angry." Lucilla watched him carefully, waiting for an explosion. "I only did the things I had to do," said Commodus. "Father's plan was crazy. The Empire, Rome, they must continue. You do understand that, don't you?" "Yes," replied Lucilla. He moved to the tall window and looked out at Rome, quiet now in the late night. "They lied to me in Germany. They told me he was dead. If they lie to me, they don't honor me. If they don't honor me, how can they ever love me?" Maximus was lying awake in the dark of the prison when he heard a guard coming. He was on his feet immediately. The guard entered and took Maximus along to another prison room. He chained him to the wall and left without a word. And into the light stepped a woman. Lucilla. Maximus stared at her. "I knew your brother would send one of his killers," he said. "I didn't think he would send his best." "Maximus, he doesn't know," Lucilla began. "My family were burnt alive," Maximus interrupted, throwing the words at her in anger. "I knew nothing of that. You must believe me. I cried for them." "As you cried for your father," said Maximus. "I have been living in a prison of fear since that day," Lucilla said. "I live in terror for my son, because he will be the next emperor." "My son was innocent," said Maximus. "So is mine," she replied. "Must my son die too, before you'll trust me?" Maximus began then to relax. "Why does it matter if I trust you or not?" he asked. "The gods have allowed you to live. Today I saw a slave become more powerful than the Emperor of Rome," she said. "Use that power, Maximus. My brother has many enemies, but until today, no one was strong enough to face him. The people were with you. They would follow you." "I am only one man. What possible difference can I make?" "Some politicians have worked all their lives for the good of Rome. One man above all. If I can arrange it, will you meet him?" she asked. "Don't you understand? I could be killed tonight in this prison, or tomorrow in the arena. I'm just a slave now." "This man wants the same things as you," said Lucilla. "Then let him kill Commodus," Maximus said in anger. Lucilla searched for a way to make him understand. "I knew a man once," she said. "He loved my father very much.
and my father loved him. This man served Rome well."
"That man is gone," said Maximus. "Your brother did his work well."
"Let me help you,"
said Lucilla. "Yes, you can help me." "Forget you ever knew me," Maximus replied, "and never come here again." He shouted for the guard. "This lady has finished with me," he said. The guard unlocked the door and led Maximus away. Chapter 9. A Man for the People. Senator Gracchus climbed the many stairs inside the Colosseum. He listened to the shouting crowd, and he was not enthusiastic about being there. He joined a group of other senators near the top of the arena. "Senator Gracchus," Falco said with surprise. "We don't often see you enjoying the pleasures of the crowd." "I don't pretend to be a man of the people," said Gracchus. "But I do try to be a man for the people." The Colosseum was full. The crowd was already beginning to shout the name of their hero and favorite gladiator. "Maximus! Maximus! Maximus!" Cassius started to introduce the next event of the day. "Now, as we celebrate the 64th day of the games, you will see how kind the Emperor is, and how he loves his people." Servants came into the arena pulling great boxes. They removed the covers and took out loaves of bread. Then they started to throw them into the crowd. Other servants appeared at the top of the steps and threw the bread down. There were thousands of loaves. The crowd cheered and caught as many loaves as they could. Commodus chose this as the best time for him to enter. Below, in the prison area, Proximo stood with Maximus. They heard a great cheer go up from the crowd. "He certainly knows how to please them," said Proximo. "Marcus Aurelius had a dream for Rome, Proximo," said Maximus. "This is not it." "Marcus Aurelius is dead, Maximus," Proximo reminded him. In the arena, the servants had thrown all the bread to the crowd, and Cassius spoke again. "The Emperor has decided there will be a special contest today. 5 years after his last fight in the Colosseum, we bring you the greatest gladiator in Roman history. Today, Tigris of France returns." The crowd loved a surprise, and they cheered in excitement as Tigris drove his chariot into the arena. He was a large man of about 45, and he looked dangerous. He wore silver armor and a silver tiger helmet with a face guard. The bright sun shone off his helmet as he rode around the arena with his arm held high. The crowd shouted and cheered even more loudly. Tigris stopped his chariot, got down, and waited in the center of the arena. He was carrying a sword and a spear, and he looked frightening. When the crowd became quieter, Cassius started to speak again. "And from the great school of Aelius Proximo, Caesar is pleased to give you the Spaniard, Maximus!" There were more cheers and shouts from the crowd. Maximus appeared from his gate. He was carrying only a short sword and a round silver shield. He had no armor or helmet. Among the crowd that day were a group of people who did not usually go to watch gladiator games. They were soldiers from the army of the north, with Valerius and Cicero at their center. They had come to see if it was true that their general was really still alive. When he got close enough for them to recognize him, they were very happy. They shouted to Maximus, but he could not hear their voices among so many others. Commodus was also watching Maximus closely. "They love him like one of their own," he said to Lucilla.
"The crowd has its favorite for a time. Then they find someone new. You'll be forgotten in a month," she replied.
"No," said Commodus, smiling.
"Much sooner than that. It's been arranged." Down on the arena sand, Maximus looked at Tigris. Only one man with a sword and spear, he thought. Something's wrong. What don't I know? Maximus stopped a short distance from Tigris. They saluted each other, and then Tigris turned to the Emperor and raised his sword. "Before we die, we salute you," he said. Maximus did not turn to the Emperor or salute him. Instead, he bent down and picked up some sand, then let it run through his fingers. Tigris pulled down the face guard on his helmet. Then he immediately attacked Maximus. Maximus struck back at him. The two men were equal contestants, both strong and fast. Maximus was the younger man, and he was very confident. He believed that he would not be killed that day. As they fought, Maximus suddenly heard a strange noise. He could not understand where it was coming from. Then he felt the ground move. Suddenly, a door opened in the sand behind him, and an enormous tiger came out. It jumped at him. He felt the tiger's breath on his back as he moved quickly to one side, and he expected the animal to land on top of him. But when he looked, he saw that it was on the end of a long chain. This was held tightly by 3 men near the wall. Tigris attacked again with great strength, forcing Maximus back toward the tiger. Maximus also attacked and drove Tigris in a new direction. Then a second door opened in the sand, and another tiger jumped into the arena. Maximus found a new position and continued to fight, as 2 more tigers suddenly appeared from the ground. There were now 4 tigers, one in each corner of the battlefield. Maximus had 5 enemies to fight, and he looked for a weak point. Then it seemed that all 4 tigers were suddenly closer. Maximus realized what was happening. When Tigris was near a tiger, the men holding the chain pulled it in a little. When Maximus was near, they let the chain out further. Finally, Maximus's strength and speed began to beat Tigris. He knocked Tigris back, and they fell onto the sand together. Maximus quickly jumped to his feet and stood over him, his sword at his throat. But then, one of the teams of servants let go of the chain, and a tiger ran at Maximus. He just had time to turn and push his sword upward into the tiger's shoulders. The animal fell on top of him and died. This gave Tigris enough time to get to his feet, pick up his sword, and prepare to attack again. Maximus was under the heavy body of the dead tiger, but he still had enough strength to throw his shield up at Tigris. It hit Tigris hard on the face guard of his helmet and bent it. It was impossible for him to see through it. Tigris was forced to drop his sword again so he could use both hands to try to pull the cover up. Maximus was able to squeeze out from under the tiger and pick up Tigris's sword. The Frenchman was still blindly pulling at his helmet as Maximus knocked him to the ground. Maximus stood over Tigris with his sword point at his throat. He looked to Commodus. All eyes in the Colosseum turned to the Emperor. Commodus was very angry, but tried not to show it. He slowly stood and looked down at Maximus. He raised his arm and held out his hand, thumb down. Maximus raised his sword to kill Tigris, but suddenly threw it down on the sand next to his head. "You fought with honor," he said. The crowd was silent. Then, suddenly, there was an enormous cheer. The shouts of "Maximus! Maximus!" grew louder and louder. Commodus turned and disappeared from sight. Senator Gracchus suddenly sat forward and started to take a real interest in the behavior of the crowd. Maximus was almost at the gladiator's exit from the arena when a group of royal guards appeared in front of him. They stepped back as Commodus walked through them and toward the great fighter. Maximus and Commodus stared at each other, just an arm's length away. The crowd was quiet now, but they could not hear what was said. "What am I going to do with you?" said Commodus. Maximus did not reply. "Once more I offer you my hand," Commodus said. He held out his arm, but Maximus did not move. "Are we so different, you and I?" said Commodus. "You take life when you have to, just as I do." "I have one more life to take," said Maximus. "Then it is finished."
"Then take it now," said Commodus. Maximus knew he only had to take one step toward Commodus, and the guards would kill him. He turned his back on the emperor and walked away. The crowd went mad. They cheered Maximus, their hero. And then some started laughing at the emperor and throwing bread at him. Gracchus could not believe his eyes. Such insults to the emperor usually resulted in death. But the people were not afraid now. All this because of one brave man. Maximus and the gladiators were chained together again for the walk back to Proximo's school. There were guards walking with them, trying to keep back hundreds of people. They all wanted to get a close look at their hero. Suddenly, Maximus heard a familiar voice and saw Cicero ahead in the crowd. "Where are you camped?" he shouted to Cicero.
"A day's ride from Rome, at Ostia,"
replied Cicero.
"We've been there all winter. The men are getting fat. They're bored."
"How soon could they be ready to fight?" asked Maximus.
"For you, sir, tomorrow,"
Cicero said proudly. The guards pushed Cicero back into the crowd. He ran ahead and came out in front of Maximus again, further along the street. This time, he pushed a small package into Maximus's hand. The guards were close, and Maximus knew he only had one chance.
"Cicero, listen carefully," he said. "You must contact Lucilla, the emperor's sister. Tell her I will meet her politician."
There was no more time. Cicero disappeared into the crowd, and Maximus was forced to move on. Later, alone in the prison at Proximo's school, Maximus took the little package out of his pocket and looked at it. Inside were the two wooden figures of his wife and son.
"Do they hear you?" a voice suddenly asked.
Maximus looked up into Juba's eyes.
"Your people," said Juba, "in the next world."
"Yes," said Maximus, looking down at the figures. Juba thought about it.
"What do you say to them?"
Maximus looked at his friend.
"To my son, to keep his head up when he rides his horse," he said. "And to my wife, that's private." Juba smiled.
Chapter Secrets and Lies. Commodus walked up and down in his room. He was a worried man. There was one other person with him, Senator Falco.
"An emperor cannot rule if he is not loved," Commodus said to Falco. "And now they love Maximus because he let Tigris live. I can't kill him now, or they will hate me. But I can't just let him continue like this. Every day he adds another insult. It's like a bad dream."
"Every day his power is greater," said Falco, "and the people are getting braver. The Senate sees it too. This is not something that will go away in a few days or weeks. Rome is beginning to move against you. He must die."
"Then they will love him even more,"
shouted Commodus. He began walking again, and soon he was calmer.
"When I went to the Senate today," he said, "I purposely told them about selling the wheat to pay for the games. And what happened?"
"Nothing," said Falco.
"Exactly. Nothing," said Commodus. "Even Gracchus was as silent as a mouse. Why?"
He stopped and looked out his window over Rome.
"We must be quiet and patient, Caesar. We must let the enemy come to us," said Falco.
Commodus began to relax a little.
"Have every senator followed," he ordered. "I want daily reports."
It was easy to find Lucilla, but much harder to speak to her. For 2 days Cicero stayed in the streets around the palace. Finally, he was lucky. Lucilla's carriage came toward him, surrounded by royal guards. There were 2 other men following her carriage, but they were not in uniform. One, a small man, was blind in one eye.
He was one of Falco's secret police. He had been very good at watching senators, but now he had been given a different job. He was watching Lucilla. As the carriage passed, Cicero called out,
My lady, I served your father at Vindobona.
Lucilla heard but did not pay him much attention. The guards pushed him away, and he ran around to the other side of the carriage.
And I served General Maximus,
he said when he got close enough. Lucilla called for her carriage to stop. She asked her servant for a coin and held it out to Cicero.
And I serve him still,
he said as he came closer to take it. Lucilla understood at once that he was a messenger. She told her guards to step back.
This is for your loyalty, soldier,
she said. Cicero took the coin and kissed her hand. He whispered,
A message from the general. He'll meet your politician.
It was enough. Cicero stepped back into the crowd, and Lucilla's carriage moved on. Proximo's school was dark and quiet. The men were all asleep except one. Proximo went quietly to wake Maximus, and then took him to his own rooms. Lucilla and Gracchus were there, waiting for Maximus. Proximo turned and left immediately. Lucilla introduced Gracchus to Maximus. "The Senate is with you," asked Maximus. "The Senate?" "Yes, I can speak for them," Gracchus replied. "Can you buy my freedom and get me out of Rome?" asked Maximus, wasting no time. "Why would I do that?" "Get me out of the city. Have fresh horses ready to take me to Ostia. My army is camped there. By the second night, I'll be back with 5,000 men," said Maximus.
"But there are new commanders," said Lucilla, "loyal to Commodus."
"Let my men see me alive. They are still loyal to me." "This is crazy," said Gracchus. "No Roman army has entered the city in 100 years. This may be no better than the rule of Commodus. And what next? After the battle to take control of Rome, you'll take your men and just leave?" "I will leave," said Maximus. "The soldiers will stay to protect you, under the command of the Senate." "When all of Rome is yours, you'll just give it back to the people?" asked Gracchus. "Tell me why." "Because that was the last wish of a dying man," said Maximus quietly. "I will kill Commodus and leave Rome to you." There was silence. Then Gracchus spoke again. "Marcus Aurelius trusted you. His daughter trusts you. So I will trust you, too. Give me 2 days." He held out his hand to Maximus. "And stay alive." In his beautiful house, Senator Gracchus listened to the cheers coming from the Colosseum. His servant helped him pack a large amount of money into a bag. "Wait outside the Colosseum. He'll come to you," he told the man. Gracchus's servant left the house and walked toward the Colosseum. All the way, he was followed by one of Falco's secret police. Proximo sat in a cafe and waited. He seemed to be watching the crowd passing, but really he was looking for Gracchus's servant. He knew immediately when he saw him, but just continued drinking his wine. He looked up and down the street. Suddenly he saw a man standing by a door, and he did not like the look of him. It was Falco's one-eyed secret policeman. Gracchus's servant stood patiently for a long time with his bag of money, but no one came to him. In the cafe, Proximo's table was now empty. He knew when to disappear. Maximus was brought to Proximo's room by 2 guards just after sunset. He was impatient, ready to start. Proximo looked at Maximus and shook his head. "I tried," he said. "It won't work. The Emperor knows too much. And this has become too dangerous for me." "Let me go," said Maximus,
and you'll be paid when I return, I promise you." "And what will happen if you don't return?" asked Proximo. "Trust me, I will kill Commodus," said Maximus. Proximo looked hard at Maximus, studying him. "I know I can trust you, General," he said. "I know you would die for honor, or for Rome, or the memory of your family. I, on the other hand, am just an entertainer." He called for his guards. "Take him away." Maximus looked straight into Proximo's eyes. "He killed the man who freed you," he said. After Maximus had gone, Proximo picked up the wooden sword that Marcus Aurelius had given him, the sign of his freedom, and he thought for a long time. Falco's spies were good at their job. They had followed Gracchus and the other senators, then Lucilla, and now Proximo. Lucilla knew their lives were in great danger, and she tried to keep her brother calm. Maximus also knew it. Commodus would come for him soon, he was certain. In the dark of night, in his prison room, he suddenly heard footsteps coming toward him. It was Proximo. He woke Juba and threw him out. Then he turned to Maximus. "Congratulations, General," he said. "You have very good friends." He stepped back, and Lucilla came into the room. Proximo left them together. "My brother plans to put Gracchus in prison," she said. "We can't wait any longer. You must leave tonight. Proximo will come for you at midnight and take you to a gate. Cicero will be there with horses." "You've done all this. You're very brave, Lucilla." "I'm tired of being brave," she said. "My brother hates everyone, and you most of all." "Because your father chose me." "No," she said. "Because my father loved you, and I loved you." Maximus took her hands in his. "I've felt alone all my life, except with you," she said. She turned to go, but Maximus held her, and they kissed. It was their first kiss for many years, and for a short time they rested in each other's arms. They separated with one last look, and Lucilla went quickly back into the dark night. Back in the palace, Lucilla hurried to her son's bedroom. She looked around and called to the servant. "Where is Lucius?"
"He's with the Emperor, my lady,"
she replied. Lucilla rushed down the palace halls, looking in all the rooms she passed. Finally, in great fear, she opened her brother's door. Commodus and Lucius were sitting together, looking at some papers. "Sister, come and join us," said Commodus, smiling. A frightening smile. "I've been reading to dear Lucius about the great Julius Caesar." He took Lucius on his knee. "And tomorrow, if you're very good, I'll tell you the story of the Emperor Claudius," he said. Commodus looked right into Lucilla's eyes. "He trusted the people closest to him, but they didn't deserve his trust." Lucilla felt faint. She sat down opposite them. "The Emperor knew they had been very busy, planning against him," Commodus went on, watching his sister's terror all the time. "And one night he sat down with one of them and said to her, 'Tell me what you have planned, or I shall kill the person you love the most. You will see me wash in their blood.'" Lucilla kept her eyes on her son, and a tear ran down her face. "And the Emperor's heart was broken, because she had wounded him more than anyone else could. And what do you think happened next, Lucius?" "I don't know, Uncle," said Lucius nervously. "She told him everything," Commodus said. Broken Plans. The sound of marching feet broke the silence of night in the area around the Colosseum.
In his room, Proximo was packing his bags, planning to leave Rome fast. He heard the marching feet coming toward the school, and he knew then how he was going to die. He picked up his bunch of keys and hurried across to the prison rooms. He was almost there when the royal guards arrived and stopped in front of his gates.
"Open up in the name of the Emperor!"
the captain called out loudly. For a few seconds, Proximo paused, without turning to look at them. Then he continued toward the prisons. Maximus had also heard the marching feet, and knew their meaning exactly. He watched as Proximo appeared through the prison entrance, keys in hand.
"Everything is ready," said Proximo.
He handed the keys to Maximus.
"It seems you've won your freedom."
"Proximo," said Maximus as he took the keys,
"are you in danger of becoming a good man?"
Proximo walked back to his rooms. The guards could see him through the gates, but he did not look across at them once.
"The Emperor commands you to open these gates, Proximo!" shouted the captain. "Do you want to die, old man? Tonight, all enemies of the Emperor must die!"
Proximo walked on and up the stairs to his room.
"Break the locks!"
shouted the captain. Maximus quickly unlocked his door. Then he and Juba let Hakon and the others out. The sound of metal hitting metal came from the gates. Maximus knew he had to go now. He handed the bunch of keys to Juba. Juba took them, understanding.
"Go,"
he said. The gates to Proximo's school flew open, and the guards rushed in. Maximus ran for the back entrance. Juba, Hakon, and the other gladiators threw themselves between the guards and Maximus and slowed them down enough for him to get away. By the back entrance, Maximus found his army sword and armor waiting for him. In the fighting, Juba was knocked to the ground and left for dead. Hakon was first wounded by a Roman sword and then shot through the chest with 4 arrows. His enormous body fell dead at the bottom of the stairs. The guards climbed over Hakon's body and raced up to Proximo's room. When they broke through the door, they found him at his desk with his back to them. In his hand was the wooden sword Marcus Aurelius had given him with his freedom. He did not turn to see death coming. The end came quickly, with 3 deep wounds to his neck and back. He died with the wooden sword hanging at his side, held tightly in his hand. Maximus came out of the back entrance to the school and waited quietly in the shadows. Suddenly, he heard a horse move. He looked toward the sound and moved out into the street. There were 2 horses waiting, one with a rider. As he got closer, he could see that it was Cicero. But something felt wrong. Maximus hid behind some rocks and whispered Cicero's name. Cicero turned.
"Maximus!"
he shouted.
"No!"
As he shouted, his horse suddenly ran, and Cicero was pulled from it by a rope around his neck. He was left hanging from the tree above. Maximus rushed forward and caught him by the legs. At the same time, 6 arrows flew into Cicero's chest, killing him immediately. Maximus had his sword ready, but there were too many guards, and he had no chance. A voice called out, "Take him alive!" and the guards quickly caught him, making him a prisoner again. At sunrise, even before their servants were awake, Senator Gaius and his wife were murdered in their bed by royal guards. 7 other senators were killed the same morning, also many private citizens. All these people had upset Commodus in some way. His secret police had done a good job. Senator Gracchus was not killed, but the guards took him away from his home and threw him into prison. In his room at the palace, Falco came to tell Commodus the news. Commodus was pleased that so many of his enemies were finished. After Falco had gone, he spoke to Lucilla.
"Lucius will stay with me now," he said, walking across the room toward her. "And if his mother even looks at me in a way that upsets me, he will die. If she decides to take her own life, he will die."
He smiled and touched her hair.
"Kiss me, sister,"
he said. It was hot and dusty in the Colosseum. Hundreds of servants at the top of the arena were throwing red flowers down onto the sand. 55,000 Romans were waiting. They had been told to expect something special. Maximus was also waiting. He knew there was only death ahead of him, but he still hoped for a soldier's death, and he kept his back straight and his head up. On his way to the arena, he passed a prison room where Juba and Proximo's other gladiators were. When he saw Maximus, Juba stood in a silent salute to a brave man and a friend. Under the floor of the Colosseum arena was a large elevator, operated by servants with ropes. It was the way the tigers had entered the arena when Maximus fought Tigris. Maximus was led there now by Quintus and the royal guards. They fastened his chains to the elevator, and Quintus himself checked them. As he bent to do this, he whispered softly, "I'm a soldier. I obey." Someone was walking toward them. Quintus stood up again and moved back. Emperor Commodus suddenly appeared with a group of servants carrying armor. The emperor himself was wearing his own gold armor. He wore this armor when he wanted to feel like a god. Commodus and 6 of his guards joined Maximus on the elevator. Maximus expected to die immediately, but Commodus smiled at him. "Listen to the crowd," he said. "They are calling for you. The general who became a slave, the slave who became a gladiator, the gladiator who insulted an emperor." He called his servants forward with the armor. "It's a good story," he said. "And now the people want to know how the story ends." "Only a great death will be good enough," Commodus continued. "And what could be better than to fight the emperor himself in the greatest arena?" Maximus did not believe him. "You will fight me?" "Why not?" Commodus said. "Do you think I'm afraid?" The servants began to fix armor to Maximus's body. First his arms, legs, and shoulders. They left the body armor until last. "I think you've been afraid all your life," Maximus answered. He knew Commodus would never have a fair fight with him. What would he do to make sure he won? "Unlike Maximus the Brave, who knows no fear," said Commodus. "I've been afraid. But you took away from me everything I loved. Since then, you're right. I have not known fear," said Maximus. "There is one thing left. You still have your life to lose," said Commodus. "I once knew a man who said, 'Death smiles at us all. A man can only smile back,'" said Maximus. "I wonder," said Commodus, "did your friend smile at his own death?" "You must know," Maximus replied. "He was your father." Commodus was silent, and they stared at each other. "You loved my father, I know," Commodus said. "But I did too. That makes us brothers, doesn't it?" He reached out his arms to Maximus and put them around him. Maximus suddenly let out a cry of pain. The emperor had a small, sharp knife in his hand. He had wounded Maximus in the side, cutting him deeply. "Smile for me now, brother," Commodus said as he pulled the knife out. Quintus stared, shocked. "Now put on his body armor. Hide the wound," Commodus said to his servants. All eyes in the Colosseum watched the center of the arena as the elevator came up. Commodus stepped off and onto the sand. It was covered with red flowers. Commodus took his sword from Quintus and turned slowly to all sides of the arena. Maximus stood straight, but he was in great pain. He looked up to the royal seats and saw Lucilla there with Lucius and Senator Gracchus. They were surrounded by guards. Commodus raised his sword high, and the sun shone off it. Maximus slowly bent down and picked up some sand from the arena. Quintus threw Maximus's sword down on the ground near his feet. Maximus picked it up slowly, and stood facing the Emperor. And the fight began. Commodus rushed at Maximus and knocked him to the ground. Maximus got to his feet with difficulty. The arena seemed to be turning around. The sun danced off the Emperor's armor and blinded him. He heard the noise of the crowd. Now it seemed to be far away, now close. Standing behind the entrance, Juba saw a thin line of blood running out from under Maximus's armor. Lucilla watched him in fear. He seemed to be looking straight at her. Could he see her? She held out her hand and called his name. Commodus struck him again. Then he raised his arms to the crowd. One or two people shouted, "Commodus!" The crowd loved a winner. Maximus almost fell again. The sun was bright, very bright. And then, suddenly, beyond all this, he saw the sun shining on a pink wall. He saw a gate in the wall, and a field of apple trees beyond it. He pushed himself forward, and as he did so, he struck Commodus. The crowd cheered. Commodus came forward again and knocked Maximus back to the ground. The crowd was silent. Only the sound of the two men could be heard. Maximus saw something else now. A woman stood in the doorway of a pink stone house. There was a field of wheat behind the house. Commodus stood over Maximus with his sword ready for the kill. "Maximus!" one person in the crowd called out in the silence. Commodus looked around angrily. The crowd repeated the cry, "Maximus!" Commodus turned back and brought his sword down. But the sound of the crowd had brought Maximus back to the arena and given him new strength. He pushed his sword up and knocked Commodus's sword away. Suddenly he got to his feet and attacked the Emperor, forcing him back. The crowd cheered loudly. Then Maximus saw an opportunity, and he pushed his sword forward. It caught Commodus under his arm, and he dropped his sword. Commodus called to Quintus, "Give me your sword!" But Quintus just stared through him. Commodus turned to the guards. "A sword! Give me a sword!" Some started to come forward, but Quintus stopped them. "Put your swords away," he ordered. Commodus looked around, suddenly frightened. He saw the great crowd and heard the name of his enemy on all sides. "Maximus! Maximus! Maximus!" they shouted. Senators joined in the cry. Juba and the gladiators shouted the name too. Lucilla stood in silence, her hand to her mouth. But Maximus was dying. He could not stand. He dropped his own sword. He seemed to be reaching out toward something. A pink stone wall with a gate. A wheat field. The sound of a child's laugh. Commodus saw Maximus fall to his knees, and he stood over him. He took the small knife in his hand again and lifted it, ready to strike Maximus one last time. Maximus saw the knife coming toward him. He held Commodus's arm and pulled him onto the ground. Suddenly, finding power from somewhere, Maximus turned the knife around and pushed it deep into Commodus's neck. There was a look of surprise on the Emperor's face. Then he took one last breath and died. Maximus slowly stood, took one step forward, and reached out a hand. Quintus went to him. "Maximus." "Quintus." "Free my men," said Maximus. The crowd was completely quiet. Maximus saw his own hand on the gate, pushing it open. Walking away from him was a woman and a child running. They looked back and smiled at him. Maximus fell to the sand. Out of the silence, Lucilla crossed the arena to the place where he lay. She took him in her arms. She could see that she could not save him, but she wanted him to hear her before the end. "Maximus," Lucilla said softly. Maximus's dying eyes opened again. Lucius is safe? He asked.
Yes.
Our sons live.
Lucilla smiled.
Our sons live, and they are proud.
She kissed him, crying, and whispered,
Go to them. You're home.
Maximus walked through the wheat field. The beautiful woman stopped and turned. She called to the boy. He stopped running and looked back. The boy then started running back along the road, toward the man in the wheat field, toward his father, who was coming home at last. Maximus died in Lucilla's arms, as she placed him gently on the sand. When she stood up, the whole arena was watching her. She turned and spoke to the senators.
Rome is free again,
she said. Lucilla stood over Maximus's body as Gracchus and the senators came down onto the sand.
He was a soldier of Rome,
Lucilla said.
Honor him.
Quintus's voice rang out. Free the prisoners! A hand turned a key, and Juba led the last of Proximo's gladiators into the silent arena. Gracchus stood by the body. Who will help me carry this man? A few voices broke the silence, calling Maximus's name. Then many more voices joined in. The sound grew and filled the arena. The gladiators picked Maximus up on their shoulders. Silent and proud, following Gracchus and the other senators in a slow march, they carried him out of the arena. Lucilla stood for a long time watching them go, while her mad brother lay dead on the bloody sand behind her. Chapter 12. Home at last. The games had ended. The Colosseum was empty and silent as Juba walked across the sand. Juba, now dressed in his African clothes, was a free man again, and soon he was going home. He still heard one voice in the arena, though. He heard Maximus, the great fighter, asking about his home in Africa, and talking to him about his own home in Spain. Juba moved to the center of the arena and found the exact place he was looking for, a small area of blood on the sand. He dropped to his knees and made a little hole in the ground. He took something from his pocket, the small wooden figures of Maximus's wife and son. He carefully put them in the hole and covered them with the earth that carried their loved one's blood. Now it would be easier for them to find each other in the next world. Now we are free, he said loudly, looking around at the empty, silent arena. This place will become dust, but I will not forget you. He stood above the place where Maximus had died. I will see you again, he said to his friend. He smiled the wide smile that he had smiled for Maximus in life, and would soon smile for his own wife and daughters. But not yet. He walked slowly out of the arena, looking back just once at the place, as the wind blew red flowers across the killing ground.